Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Audrey and I like to talk about all things beauty, books, lifestyle, slow living, that kind of stuff. So if that's what you're into, feel free to subscribe and stick around for more videos. And today I will be telling you all about the books that I read in the month of May. It was a big month for me. I read, I think 13 books. One of them I DNF'd, but it was a good reading month and I have a lot of thoughts. Oh, and I have some exciting news. My friend Sam and I are starting a fantasy book club on Discord. It's called Mages and Pages. I will have the link to join below. And it's a very low-key, low-commitment book discussion group. You do not have to read the monthly book to be a part of the server. We have things like mental health and pets and plants and art and all kinds of fun things. So it's a cool community to meet other enjoyers of the genre and just a wholesome place on the internet to talk about the things we love. So I'd love for you to join if that's what you're into. I will have that linked below. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this month's reads. So the first book that I read this month was The Princess Bride. This is a fantasy classic, most well known for its movie adaptation. It's a love story where this young girl is in love, her love interest goes missing, she's devastated, she becomes betrothed to the prince of the land who's totally evil. So it has a lot of like fantasy tropey things, but the humor in it is so on point that it kind of is very self-aware and makes fun of itself. This is my favorite movie of all time. It was my favorite movie as a kid. It left a huge impression on me, so I knew that when I wanted to start taking reading more seriously that this was the natural place for me to start. What is my hair doing? Okay, thank you. This was a very enjoyable read. I had a lot of fun. However, I will say that I did enjoy the movie adaptation more than the book. They streamlined it in a lot of areas. The thing is that William Goldman was a producer for the movie, so I don't feel like the movie was lacking any of the charm or wonder that this book has, but it streamlined a lot of areas that made it a lot more enjoyable and consumable, and honestly that makes a difference for me. And I never liked the movie more than the book, but this is an instance where I actually did like the movie more than the book. I still had a lot of fun reading this. It's very fast-paced, very witty, very funny, literally the most lovable characters of all time. Like, oof. That's my thoughts on this book. Unfortunately, I can't say that it held up to my expectations just because the movie is so legendary in my eyes. Alright, up next, Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is one of my new favorite books. It follows the story of a princess who is trying to save her older sister from an abusive marriage. The sister is married to the king of an allying kingdom, so there's political tension, there's scheming and coups and curses, and it's so exciting. There's two things that I completely adore about this book. First thing, this book keeps its lightheartedness and its good humor despite covering some really dark themes. I am still at a loss on how a book that contains things like cannibalism and domestic abuse and murder and still ends up being really lighthearted and fun. This actually pulled it off really well. The other thing that I really love about this book is that the protagonist is 30 years old. Two of the main characters are senior ladies. How cool is that? You never see that anymore. Personally, as a 24-year-old, I am so sick of reading about protagonists who are 16 and 17 years old. I just cannot relate to a character anymore that is literally going through puberty. That's just not something that is interesting to me. Literally going through puberty. I have nothing in common with them. I am kind of over it. Having a main character that was actually older than me and then two leading characters be older age was so exciting, and it didn't feel like this book was trying to be counterculture or diverse or anything like that. This book was genuinely awesome, and it just happened to have really strong female characters who were older in age, and I think that's awesome. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is definitely going to be one of my favorites of the year. Up next is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I picked this one up because I thought that my Half Price Books was having a meet and greet with Colleen Hoover, and it turns out It was from a previous year, so I was duped. But anyways, I'm glad I read this one because it's a new classic and there's a movie coming out, so it's the talk of the town. But anyways, you've probably heard a bunch of people talk about this. It basically follows the story of starts out as a love story, turns into a nightmare. Trigger warnings for domestic abuse and rape, but yeah, it was a really tense and difficult read for me. I am glad that I read it because I work in the mental health space and it's always been hard for me to sympathize with women who stay in abusive situations. Seeing this kind of fictional first-hand account I was able to develop some empathy for women in this situation where before I had a lot of judgment that I needed to work through, which is hard for me to say. I don't want to ever judge. I have been fortunate enough to not understand domestic abuse on a first-hand level, so it was always a subject for me that I've been wanting to learn more about and educate myself more about so that I could eradicate those judgments and biases that I had. I think that this book was really successful in helping me cover some of that ground. My biggest criticism for this book was that even though this story contained a lot of nitty-gritty, like real pain, I still feel like this situation was very idealized. I feel like the main character was in an ideal situation where she had a ton of money and a great support system, and it was very easy for her to make the choices that she does in this book. And I don't feel like that is a good representation of domestic abuse, where a lot of times there is a financial aspect and there is a social support aspect. It kind of, I feel like, glosses over those things in the story. Mister, no eating plants. No. My cat is determined to poison himself. Anyways, that's my biggest criticism of It Ends With Us, but clearly I feel like I learned a lot from the story, and no story is perfect, so I really appreciate everything that this book taught me. Up next is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I don't have the physical copy of this book because I actually read the audiobook, and I strongly recommend the audiobook version. It's narrated by Jeanette McCurdy herself, and she does an astounding job. Her telling of her story is so powerful. She actually gets choked up at times, and it just, like, you know that the emotion is so real in her. So I love Jeanette McCurdy so much. I respect her so much for coming out and telling her story. Basically, I'm Glad My Mom Died tells the story of Jeanette's career in acting, her relationship with her mother, and her struggle with addiction and eating disorder. She really went through so much in her life that was covered up by her family and by the media, and I am so gripped by the story of her life and so touched by everything she shared with us. I was an iCarly kid growing up. I loved Jeanette in iCarly. I loved her in like her Nickelodeon roles, and I cannot go back and watch those now because of how real she was with us, with her story. It totally changed my perspective on the entertainment industry. I mean, we know that there's an unrealistic beauty standard for young women, but this is just such a beautiful first-hand account of how damaging it really can be. I know that everybody and their grandmas, this is another one that is just such a classic and everybody has read, but my two takeaways would be, one, read the audiobook. Jeanette does an amazing job, and two, just know that you're gonna binge this one. There is no other way to consume it. Another classic that I read this month was The Picture of Dorian Gray. I don't really have a whole lot to say on this one. It's pretty short but pretty dense. I went to a classical high school, so this kind of brought me back to the type of reading that we would do in school, and honestly it kind of helped me realize that I'm kind of over the classics. My teachers would be cringing at me, but I'm kind of over stories about rich men talking about their ideas on aesthetics and philosophy and art. Like, I'm so over it. I had fun reading this. I actually listened to the audiobook. It was narrated by Russell Tover. It's fun to listen to while I was driving, but honestly, like, kudos to this book for making me realize that I can enjoy reading now and I don't have to. I still want to pick up a few classics and kind of round out my reading library, but overall, like, I gave this one 3 out of 5. It was okay. Up next, was The Fellowship of the Ring by Tolkien, the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's literally nothing for me to say about this book other than I read this during a time that I was going through a lot mentally. I live in Texas, and there was an event that happened that I won't go into detail for because it's very upsetting to me and my community, but there were actually several events that happened that were very upsetting and made me not super excited to live where I live. This story was an escape for me, and as much as some people really don't like Tolkien's super uber giga hyper detailed descriptions of scenery and environments, this was so immersive and so descriptive that I was able to completely forget where I was. And when I was in a very dark place mentally, this gave me a very happy place to be instead. That's what I'll say about this book. And I can't wait to read the rest of the trilogy. Next this month, I read Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. This is a short literary work that follows the story of a teenage girl who follows her father and a small group of anthropology students in UK to basically live like the ancient Britons for 2 weeks. Much as that describes the premise and setup of this plot, I cannot even begin to describe the depth of this story. Covers the themes of British nationalism and misogyny and young queer love. Not expected. Not gonna lie, I picked this one up for the cover art. It's gorgeous and it appealed to me, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I figured it's super short, it's barely 200 pages, I might as well give it a go. I ended up really loving this one. I gave it 5 out of 5. However, I would not recommend this book to everybody. It is dark, it is uncomfortable, and it's kind of hard to read. There are no quotation books in this story. The dialogue is jumbled up into the actual narration of the book. So it's very confusing, it's very stream of consciousness thought. So you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and being confused to be able to enjoy this book, which is why it has very mixed reviews. A lot of people don't like it. They say it's too confusing, they say it's too challenging. So if you have to know what is happening to be comfortable in a book, then I don't recommend this one for you. It was a 5 out of 5 for me. If you're willing to give it a chance and you love it too, then awesome, but if not, you've been warned. Up next is Dust to Dust by C.E. McClelland. This was the only book that I did not finish this month. As you can see, I got almost halfway through. I got 47% of the way through. I have thoughts about this book. First of all, this is a magical realism, low fantasy book about a man who loses his wife and young kid in a fire. He travels to Ireland to release their ashes, and he meets some interesting characters, encounters some magical things, and basically it's a story of healing from his grief, new beginnings, and hope. I actually picked this book up at a Meet Author event where I met the author himself. He was a lovely man, genuinely sold me on his book. I was so excited for it. I will say, this was not my perfect book. Let me just say this. This book was very charming. It had the pacing and humor of a romantic comedy, which will be fantastic for a lot of people, but was not perfect for me. I found myself not super immersed in this story for one reason and one reason only, and that is because the writing came across very male fantasy to me. The main character was irresistible to women. He had women throwing themselves on him in his past, present, and future, and I just couldn't see why. We were not told why he was so irresistible to women, why he was so attractive to them, and it just came across a very male fantasy halfway through, and this book didn't pass the Bechdel test, and the women characters don't really have any interest or development outside of their romantic appeal to the main character. So for those reasons, I was kind of put off by a female reader. I couldn't really get myself into this one. I gave it a fair chance. I got almost halfway through, and who knows if this book could really turn itself around in the final half, but I was not sold on it in the first half, and I had to put it down because of how frustrating that main character was for me. If you are interested in Irish folklore and mythology, if you are interested in a lighthearted, rom-com-y feeling story about healing and loss, you will probably love this book. This was just not my perfect book. This author is the coolest human ever, so I really wanted to love it, but unfortunately, it was not meant to be. Up next is Popisho. I read this as part of Allison Page's book club. Man, oh man, this is another one that I loved that a lot of people did not. I got very mixed reviews because this is another story where you need to be comfortable with being confused with ambiguity. A lot of people really don't like that. I'm very much okay with it. Basically covers the events of fictional island cluster called Popisho, the events of one day and 3 different characters. The twist is that everybody on this island has like some kind of magical quirk called a pores. The blurb on this book cannot even begin to describe what actually goes on in the story though. There are so many magical, whimsical twists and turns. I was so enthralled by this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5 on my story graph. I freaking love this book. I think the most exciting thing for me was to learn so much about this culture. It's fictional. I know that it's based on Jamaican culture, and I feel like I learned a lot from this fictional vignette that only covers the events of one day, but I feel like I learned so much about this culture's values and customs and beliefs and struggles, and it was so, that's what I love about fantasy. This is a big boy. It was almost 500 pages, but I finished it in 3 days, which I'm super proud of myself for because it was a work of art. I seriously love this book. Up next is Wayward by Amelia Hart. This was another 5 out of 5. I read so many books this month that I really loved, and I think that honestly a lot of people will love this one too. I feel like I can recommend this to a broad audience, unlike a couple of my other favorites this month. This follows the story of 3 women from the same bloodline living in UK. One of them is during the 1600s witch hunts. One of them is living in her wealthy, oppressive family's manor during the First World War. The final woman is fleeing from an abusive relationship in the present day. Every single one of these characters was so interesting to me. My favorite was definitely Violet, the one living during World War II. She had a lot of spunk and interest and was very cool. There were some pretty major character flaws in all of the main characters, which is something that is very interesting to me. It had great queer representation, which is awesome, especially for a historical novel. Like you don't really see that a lot. And this is one of those stories where magic is an integral part of the characters and the plot and the world, but it's so subtle and it feels so real. It's not like bam, in your face wizards, unicorns, fairies. Like, it feels so real and so important. It's just enchanting and exciting, and I cannot recommend this book enough. Fantasy, historical fiction, or magical realism, if you enjoy any of those genres, you'll love this book. And it's the author's debut work. I was so ready to pick up everything that Amelia Hart had ever written, and then it was like, oh, this is the only thing she's ever written. Ma'am, for this to be your debut work, I'm so blown away, and it makes me appreciate this book even more, even though I'm disappointed that she doesn't have more things out for me to read right now. We'll just have to wait patiently because this one came out in March, so it could be a hot second. Okay, just a couple left. If Cats Disappear from the World by Genki Kawamura. This is a short Japanese magical realism book about a man who realizes that he has a terminal illness and only has a little bit of time left to live. The devil shows up in his apartment and gives him the deal to elongate his life by 1 day for one thing that he gives up. A different thing disappears from the world each day, and the man gets to live another day. It gets kind of existential. It covers things like grief and death and loss and impermanence. I had fun in those moments. I don't feel like it really scratched the surface of any of those topics very deeply. It kept things very like light and punchy and fast. Can't say that this one was very exciting to me in the existential ways that I was looking forward to in this book. Mostly it was very silly, with a few attempts of kind of covering some darker topics in a fun and whimsical way. So this wasn't my perfect book. I gave it a 3 out of 5. It was a lot of fun, and it was short, and it was kind of a breath of fresh air for me to read after some pretty hefty books this month. So I enjoyed my time here. It was cute. I liked it. Alright, the final book I read was The Invisible Life of Addie larue. I read the audiobook version, so I don't have the physical copy with me. I know that this book is insanely popular. I know that it is the hot topic right now and that everybody loves it. I have some very complicated feelings about it. So first of all, the first half of this book is flawless. Setup, the mystery, the characters, everything is perfect. I was so into it. I could not put it down in the first half. By the second half, let me start by explaining the premise. The main character is Addie LaRue. She is a woman born in the 1600s in France, and she makes a deal with a god to live forever in exchange for not being remembered by anybody the moment that she walks out of a door. She's incapable of holding a relationship with anybody, and she is forgotten by everyone, including her own parents and everybody that she knows the moment that she makes this deal. She lives her life until present day, 300 years later, when she runs into a handsome stranger in a bookstore and he remembers her. So there's this big mystery, and its premise is so exciting. Let me just say, the second half of this book, I felt like it was dragging. I was not interested in it at all. I felt like the romantic interest was really not that likable and rather boring. I didn't find myself rooting for their relationship. It was exciting that somebody had remembered Addie, and I was happy for her in that sense, but I was not that into Henry as a character. Like, I just felt like he was kind of boring and unlikable and kind of a weenie. So yeah, I don't know. If this is your favorite book in the world, you have plenty of people who agree with you, and I'm so happy that you were able to enjoy this book. But I did not feel the same. I feel like the writing was excellent. The descriptions and analogies and metaphors were very beautiful and poetic, and I was able to enjoy it in that sense. But by the end of the book, I was just mostly frustrated by the way it had turned out. All in all, I gave this a 3 out of 5 because it was very well written, but the pacing and the characters, I just was kind of meh by the end. So I was disappointed that the second half of it kind of dropped off, but this is a very popular book. A lot of people loved it. I think I have a minority opinion here. Ugh, that's everything that I read this month. Ugh. I can finally breathe now. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. Make sure you keep it civil whether you're talking to me or another person in the comments. We all have our own tastes, and that makes life fun. And if you are interested in joining a fantasy book club where we read a fantasy book a month where we decide together and have a fun little corner of the internet where we share some of the same interests, feel free to join. That link will be in the description below. And thank you so much for watching. I have so much fun talking about the things I read this month. And stay tuned for more things coming up on my channel soon. I'll have a lip gloss declutter and a monthly favorites for things that are beauty related coming up soon. All right, I think that's just about all the words I have left in my body. So thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.